I would like to welcome everyone to this discussion on digital and data security in a work from anywhere world. My name is Andy Johnston. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Grand Rapids Chamber. It's my pleasure to be your moderator, traffic cop, general layperson, asking technical experts questions here today. And we do have a great panel of experts joining us for a discussion on best practices and experiences for keeping vulnerable data secure, especially for highly regulated industries. We're going to do the live Q&A session here, so don't be shy about entering your questions into the chat. I think we all find that creates the most valuable experience for everyone, so we can get your questions answered. This is certainly an important issue. At the Grand Rapids Chamber, we're all about creating environments that support business success. And you know, the business world, a huge portion of that is virtual now. It is data. So how do we ensure business success in all environments, including in the virtual and digital space? And why is this important? Hackers attack every 39 seconds on average, 2,500 times a day. 43% of cybercrime around the world is also targeted at small businesses. So it's not just a big business issue, which we often hear about in the headlines. Damage related to cybercrime is projected to hit $6 trillion annually by 2021, and 60% of small businesses that are victims of a cyber attack go out of business within 6 months. So a lot to talk about here, and hopefully a lot of takeaways for you as attendees that you can implement in your business walking out of here. So let me introduce our panelists today. You don't need to know me, except for as the moderator traffic cop for your Grand Rapids Chamber. But our experts today are, of course, Chip LaFleur, president of LaFleur Marketing. Chip has an industry-leading marketing agency and was just talking about the number of leads that seem to be coming in as companies try to innovate and deal with a ton of issues. And his business has a lot of experience building comprehensive data-driven digital marketing strategies and really delivering results for clients. We also have Scott Dresen here. He's a Senior Vice President and CTO/CISO of Information Services for Spectrum Health, which I like to remind everyone is the largest employer in West Michigan by quite a lot. And as Chief Technology and Information Security Officer, Scott is accountable for leading the enterprise technology and information functions for Spectrum Health and Spectrum Health entities. And Dirk Arends is our final panelist, president of Virtual Systems. Dirk leads Virtual Systems, which is a cloud-first IT company based here in Grand Rapids, helping companies build secure and scalable IT systems that are allowing employees to be productive from anywhere at any and on any device. So we're here to talk about cybersecurity. I always think it's good to start with definitions. Cybersecurity or computer security, information technology security is the protection of computer systems and networks from the theft or damage to their hardware, software, electronic data, as well as from the disruption or misdirection of the services they provide. So to kick things off, what I'd like to do is I'll start with Chip LaFleur. Let's start with you. Talk about how you've seen the issue of digital and data security rise in importance, and what do you see from your clients? What are they doing about it? What are they struggling with?
That's a good question. It's also kind of a good why am I here start of this whole thing. So, we don't do security. I mean, we do security for our business and for our systems, but we interact with client data often. With our clients' data, they send it to us. So we have customer lists, we have sensitive information, we have secure financial information like credit card information, social security numbers. And as a business that interfaces with other organizations, we have to touch that information many, many times. And so as we do that, I have this like rising paranoia of what happens if something goes wrong? Like if we lose this information, if our systems get compromised, what's the risk? And we have all the insurance in place that we need to have. We have insurance specifically for cyber breaches. But who wants to use their insurance? I mean, that is literally the last case, the last worst case scenario. So it's a subject that's really interesting to me. And then as we talk to our clients who are really spread out throughout the country, we work with a lot of law firms, so we're dealing with pretty sensitive information. I keep hearing these stories, and the cadence of these stories just keeps kind of increasing. And so, we have one client that we worked with for a long time, and they found out that they got one of the ransomware attacks, and they thought that they had good security to begin with. They thought they had a good backup solution, but their backup solution was limited to 256 characters, and their directory structure was bigger than that in many cases. So they just lost data. Now, fortunately, that was a small-ish subset of that data, but there was no way to get it back. We've had another client, again, in the legal space who had somebody hack into their 365 account because they didn't have multi-factor authentication. They get in there, send out an email to their entire address list asking them to wire money. So now all of the lawyers that they work with, the legal community that they work with in the state and the city that they're in, receives this email, which causes them to lose some credibility. Fortunately, it doesn't seem anybody fell for it, but we've seen that grow. And then just knowing Dirk and Scott, for quite some time, the conversations we've had with them, we hear about this increase as people work from home. And I know, having about 20, 21 employees, when people go home, they work all from their own devices. And when they work from their own devices, that means we may or may not have antivirus on those devices, firewall. We don't know how they're updating it. They're using home routers. And so that's why, I wanted to have this conversation, especially with these guys who really know this stuff and can offer some protection for the businesses that are out there.
Yeah, and I think you set up a lot of the topics we're going to get to in the next 50 minutes here. Scott, I would like to go next to you. Question we received from one of our registrants today, one of our attendees. What's the number one thing you worry about with work from home? 30,000 employees, how many of them are working from home? Kind of the what keeps you up at night question with all those staff making that transition to work from home. What worries you when it comes to data and some of the common practices you need to keep data protected?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Certainly there's quite a bit that I think about in the context of the work remote, but I guess, if you look at this visual that I've got on the screen, this sort of summarizes what might keep me up at night. This represents, blocked connection attempts that were made to a firewall. And it's, you can see obviously the connection attempts are coming from all over the planet. The darker shades of, as you get to oranges and reds increase, in terms of the higher number of connections from those locations. And what's scary about this image in many respects is that it's not the corporate network of Spectrum Health. It's not LaFleur Marketing. It's not even a business. These are block connection attempts from my home network. And it happens every day, every single day. I've been running this visual on my network for several years now. And it never changes. It's always consistent. And what's sort of scary about that is the world we live in with the connectedness means that you're going to have people trying to connect to you with malintent and not for purposes that are otherwise, legitimate. I don't run any services out of my house that anyone would connect to externally. I don't host mail. I don't run web servers. We use the internet like everyone else. I connect to work, things of that type. So this is just a visual reminder of what's happening every day, and every one of us are experiencing this in our own homes and our own businesses. And so, what I think about with the remote workforce, the one issue that always comes for me top of mind is, are you using multi-factor authentication for your employees when they connect in remotely? I cannot underscore the importance of that and the significance of how much that can benefit you in reducing the risk of you having an exposure or a breach. Certainly in the healthcare space over the last 8 months 5 or 6 months, really frankly, since COVID started, we've seen a material increase in the number of our third parties that are having breaches, as we were discussing sort of right before the webinar started, ransomware events or other targeted attacks that are being successful, usually initiated through business email compromise, where a phishing attack is getting someone to give up their username and password. And then the bad guy is using that information to log in remotely to the network and then compromise it from there. And in many of the cases that I've been involved in through work, Had they had multi-factor authentication enabled, they would have prevented that from happening. And so the significance of that as a risk mitigator is huge. And for me, that's the thing I think about a lot for remote workers.
Dirk, building off that, is that something we see a lot of uptake on from companies, a lot of people implementing that multi-factor? And then what other employee training challenges may exist related to remote work environments and security?
Yeah, I think a lot are. I think it's a great question, but there's a lot of industry buzz around it. A lot of banks and, a lot of vendors we use every day are starting to require multi-factor for the reason that Scott is saying. I mean, it's there's a good kind of term, I guess, in information security that I think is handy to kind of keep front of mind, and that is assume breach. Assume that, you're probably, a password's going to get cracked. If you're watching, if you got some dark web monitoring happening, and I know Chip, I'm going to tee up Chip and his conversation about a resource that he uses here, but there's a lot of ways that you can see, has my information already been exposed? What breaches has my data already been a part of? And you've got a password, a username and a password that's out there. If you're like most people, you reuse that. So it's hanging out in a few places, and bad guys know that. So they'll use that stuff. If they really want to get at your stuff, you can use password cracking software and big computers to come up with every combination of 8 digits in a couple hours. So the idea that you should probably just assume that your information's out there, it's probably going to get had by somebody. And what multi-factor does, if you don't know, is just pings your phone, pings another device and says, hey, you're logging in. Are you good with this? So that if somebody else has it, then obviously, and it's happened to me, and I don't know how many other people it's happened to. I'm sure quite a few, but I'll see it on different accounts from time to time. Like, hey, somebody's logging in. You good with this? Which the first time I saw it, I think I freaked out. I was like, what do I push? Do I push something? And I had to talk myself down from the ledge. Do nothing, do nothing. So anyway, yeah, I mean, it's a big problem. And I guess to the second part of your question, like what's important in a work anywhere world? And I think it is training, kind of creating a culture of not paranoia, but awareness among your people, because people are the biggest vulnerability in your organization. We click things, we're interested in things. Everything from bots to humans are after access to our data, and they're learning, both of them, bots and humans are, and so it's becoming harder and harder. So having a mentality that kind of says, how am I being careful right now, instead of, I guess getting a hold of that impulse control. And that comes from creating a culture of security, but also, there's great ways to train your employees too. So
we kind of have a running joke at the chamber of, if you get an email from our president, Rick Baker, that says, urgent, I need to see you immediately, that just means you've been an employee long enough, because somewhere along the line, he clearly fell for, he was click happy on something.
Yeah.
Dirk mentioned you had some kind of ways to see if you've been cracked or that kind of resources.
Yep. So this site right here is what I use, is one of the tools I use anyways. There's a handful. So some of your credit card companies and other entities are going to offer this as a service too. But if you want a quick checkup and see, has your email address at least been involved in a breach? It's just, have I been owned, basically, depending on how you want to pronounce it. But you go here, have I been owned, but with a P. Pop in I'm going to use my personal, my Gmail, my Gmail email here. But I click on this link, and it's going to do a quick search, and it says, yep, this has been involved in a breach. And so what this means is that when we look down here at this list, these are not small organizations, right? This is not like you went to the wrong website and you entered your information and you got breached. Adobe, Discuss, Experian, Dropbox, Heroes of New Earth, I guess. I played that once in 2012, maybe. LinkedIn, Under Armour, you name it. So like in 23 different scenarios, my email address got associated with a password and someone gained access to that. Now this is saying this gives you a little bit more detail in here, but you know, I've been on 23 breach sites. There were no pastes. And so what a paste means is that not only did someone find a username and password, but they copied it onto a more accessible place. But whoever hacked these sites in the first place is by default a bad actor. So they have that login. And so that means that if I use that same login at my bank, at my email, then they can get into those things too if I don't have multi-factor authentication. And you know, Dirk and Scott both talked about the importance of that. And it's also hard to get people to buy into it, right? Like that's one of the challenges we see is you need to do it, but there's this resistance to doing it because it creates a potential like inconvenience. But that inconvenience is so insurmountably small, or unbelievably small, I should say, compared to the inconvenience of having your system breached. You know, what's the stat, Dirk? I think you know it. What's the percentage of businesses that don't survive a year after being breached?
I think Andy just listed it.
Yeah, it was something like 60%.
60.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
And you know, as an end user, you know, I would fall in that category. Like, what are you talking about? I got to have something sent to my cell phone just to open up my computer. But when you put the reasoning behind it, you're right. It's quick. It's easy. It's just part of your day. Scott, what have you guys seen at Spectrum when you're trying to, you know, push security out across, you know, the multitude, the tens of thousands of people?
Well, it's certainly challenging. And, you know, I think Dirk's point about education and awareness and creating that culture of security is spot on. It's one of the most effective ways because, you know, your employees are both your first line of defense as well, likely your last line of defense. And so having them understand it and being aware, I think it's been easier in the last several years as more and more of these breaches have occurred. People are feeling the personal impact of that. I mean, I go to sessions where I'm presenting in front of large groups and we'll ask the question of the audience, how many people in this room have had a credit card compromised? And most people more often than not are raising their hands. I've stopped checking the have you been pwned site because there have been so many breaches of significance that I know my information and my data is out there. And so I don't have to think about it. And so for us, you know, we being a healthcare highly regulated environment, you know, have had multi-factor authentication for years, but I recall very early in my time at Spectrum Health, it was a challenge at times because we were on the forefront of that compared to our peers, and we had a lot of pushback from our staff physicians and other employees who felt it was an inconvenience. However, since then and in the subsequent, you know, years more recently, with so many other services like banks and your online retail services, using multi-factor authentication, people are getting more accustomed to it and more comfortable. And frankly, to be honest with you, we made it a requirement for remote access that you couldn't get access to your environment without it if you were off campus. And so that became an incentive as well. At the same time, you can offer technologies to help minimize that impact to the end user. So there are mobile device management solutions that companies can employ on their mobile devices that would use a certificate as a form of that second factor that don't require them to put in a user code or push a button. There are newer software-based solutions that will prompt you to say, yes, this is okay, versus having to type in the 6-digit PIN. It's much more integrated with your mobile experience, which you're used to, versus the older days where you had a special little key fob you'd carry around that was more onerous. You know, I think if you look at the banks, they're usually on the cutting edge of this type of technology where they use adaptive authentication, whereby your behaviors, whether it be a voice recognition or, you know, the locations from which you're logging in, typically they have an ability to use AI to help understand, are you really the person you claim to be, and I'll let you in without requiring that. But where they have questions, they may prompt you for additional authentication. So, you know, training and awareness, phishing education is huge. To get people. So we will do phishing campaigns in the organization where we'll actually purposely send out messages to people. And if they happen to click on them and get phished successfully, we will then divert them to a site where we give them in the moment education to understand how to recognize phishing messages and be more aware of it.
You're pranking Spectrum Health employees in order to get better data security. I love it.
And it's working. So not only are we doing it, but we actually have to make it harder because our successful phish identification rate was going up, which was an indicator that people were starting to understand to look for the likely signs of a phish. So we actually had to make it more difficult because our staff were getting smarter and more aware. And I know of stories where people have reported a phish that they thought was a legitimate phishing campaign from internal that turned out to be an external phish that was legitimate and was malicious, and allowed us to take action to help make sure it wasn't going to be delivered elsewhere in the organization. So it can be a very effective way of creating that awareness and understanding.
Oh, I love that. So it's like education, right? It's mandating it, just like we've all been forced to become Zoom experts. If you want to use email, you got to do these things. And then I like the continual, testing keeps everybody on their toes. Dirk, another question we had from the audience was kind of, in addition to maybe more higher level, is how often should, businesses, small, large, I guess, be looking at their cybersecurity practices to reassess them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to quick piggyback on what Scott was talking about and say, if you are listening to this and you're in the SMB or mid-size space, those same tools that Scott's talking about are available to you. You can Google them. I don't want to make a sales pitch on it, although Virtual Systems does do it, but they are easy. They're plug and play. They're not very expensive, and super important, I think, just to creating the right culture of security there. So, but to your question, I think you want to try to find what's the right balance between being confident in your cybersecurity maturity framework, but also being open to new ideas and new thoughts. And we typically tell our customers, reevaluate maybe twice a year. So just come back to the table and kind of think through. It can be a half-hour, 1 hour session with the right people who are building that framework for you. But probably, once or twice a year is right to just think through, unless you see something out there and you're like, oh, we're not doing any of this employee training. Should we come back to the table and quick have a conversation, decide if that's something that we should do? But as long as you've been building that maturity framework for a while, I think the right pace is to reevaluate a couple times a year and just keep looking for what else can we be doing better? Is this effective? But you also got to give it, the right amount of time to season in to see the effectiveness. So I don't know, Scott, you got a lot of experience here, so I'd love to hear your take on that too, how often you guys are looking at that. And Chip too, as a just, typical SMB, how often are you guys thinking about it?
I think your advice is sound, and would agree completely, especially for small and mid-sized businesses. A couple times a year, sitting down, evaluating where you're at. Are you seeing anything that looks like it would be of concern that you want to change your course with? Potentially, if there's any way for you to measure anything in between those time periods, just for a monthly update. As a large enterprise, we will do an annual cybersecurity program assessment where we'll have either an external third party come in to give us an objective point of view once every 2 or 3 years. And in the intervening years, we'll have our internal audit team doing that evaluation. And we actually are just kicking our annual assessment off right now. We do have regulatory requirements that obligate us to do a risk assessment on an annual basis. And that's a separate process, but equally valuable for us to help us understand where we have risk that we need to mitigate. And then in the intervening time between then, having those regular touch points, just looking at your program and having metrics that are important to understand. How frequently are you seeing attacks? How many phishing attempts are successful in getting through? How effective is your patching of your computers? Are you patching on a regular basis? Because that can be a very effective way of minimizing risk, in a very easy and low cost way of minimizing risk. Things like that, the low hanging fruit, if you will.
Yeah. So from my perspective, I think that I agree with what both of you are saying from the perspective of, if you are an organization that has something in place, then it should be looked at maybe a couple of times a year and try to keep up with it. For a lot of the clients that we start working with, they don't have the baseline. And so it's one of the early conversations that I have with them, because, and you can frame it a couple of different ways. I like to think I'm trying to be a decent human being by talking about this with them and making sure their businesses are safe. But also, if they get breached, we're probably going to lose them as a client because they're going to go out of business. And so I want them to not get breached because I want them to be successful, and also because I want to stay successful. And so what I see when we go into an organization and we're dealing with their marketing, but that involves setting up accounts, sharing passwords, doing a lot of things like that, data sharing and all of that. And I see this very low baseline, right? And so I think there's two answers. One is you should review that at least twice a year. But I think that if you don't have a baseline in place, if you don't have a security policy in place, you need to do that now. And you touched on a couple of things, Scott, that are not even visible in a lot of the places that we go into. They are after we get established there. But multi-factor authentication, and like Dirk said, those things are not unreachable, right? So Office 365 has it, it's free. Password management, we use LastPass, but there's other solutions there. Turn on multi-factor authentication there. It's, I think, $7 or $1 per user per month for enterprise. The phishing stuff, that we actually do that through virtual systems, but there's a lot of places that you can do that with. KnowBe4 is the platform we use, and I think it's a couple dollars per person. Like it's not expensive at all. And so if you're not doing at least those 2 to 3 things, then you need to have a baseline assessment now, because you're more at risk now than you've ever been before. So start with that and then go from there.
You talked about like the impact it has on businesses, and one of them is tarnished reputation. Is part of that plan or policy about how do we communicate when an event like this happens?
For sure. So I mean, anytime you have someone remove information from your network, from your system, you have to inform everyone who's been impacted. You don't know what that person or entity is going to do with that information. So you have to make a very quick assessment. Was this something that was purposefully taken for a malicious purpose? And you have to err on the safe side and identify that. And then you have to have that communication. And that's a real tough conversation to have, right? So if it's your customers and you run e-commerce and you had a breach that involved passwords or even just username, I mean, any sort of breach, you have to inform the people who have been subject to that breach. And so I think you have to have a communication plan in place there. What we saw with Experian, what we've seen with Dropbox, I mean, they're getting a PR company involved early and they're trying to get ahead of it, but there's no great getting ahead of it other than to say, hey, look, this has happened. I know, Scott, you mentioned a couple of places that are large entities and they've gotten hit with ransomware, with other things that have breached their databases. So I don't think it's a bad idea to have a communication in your plan in your back pocket for something like this to happen. But before I do that, I would start with those other 3 things: password management, multi-factor authentication, and at least some sort of phishing testing, something like that.
Chip, you mentioned another resource in the beginning of the session that I think would be of value for those organizations that have cyber insurance. Many times your cyber insurance carrier is going to have services and capabilities to work with you to help you. I know we definitely leverage our cyber insurance carrier to provide input that helps shape our information security program. They have resources, products, templates, documents that would help with some of that incident response type of documentation you described, because you certainly want to have that established before you have an event, not during it, because there is a lot of challenge when you're in the midst of something, let alone coming up with all the communication plan you need to be following. So certainly lean on your cyber insurance carriers. If you maintain policies, they can be a very helpful asset.
A couple specific questions I want to get to that registrants submitted as they registered. Scott, working from home, what do you recommend for users who need to use physical paper copies of protected health information to do their job? How much of a security risk would it be if they're having those papers at home?
It's a great question, and one we certainly have to deal with in the healthcare sector. But let me start by saying, initially, it's not just the work remote that has created this question, because even prior to COVID, we have a mobile workforce. People are coming and going into and out of the office, and they're taking papers with them from the office to home, whether they're here remotely now or not. So that's been a problem that's existed for a while. So a lot of our controls are via policy that mandate certain behaviors we expect of people when they're managing sensitive data in the home environment. So maintaining a safe and lockable storage cabinet where you can keep that information if it's going to be out and available or accessible to people that might be in your home. Having documents shredded either in your home when you're done using them, or if you're coming into the office regularly, bring that data and that information back into the office for proper shredding. Just don't throw it out into your trash can. physical attributes of your workspace at home? Can you have an environment where you can have safe conversations outside of earshot of other people that might be in the home? Do you have a door that you can close to have the privacy you need for those types of discussions? And then again, back to that education and awareness, just being vigilant with how you're managing your sensitive data, both on paper or electronically, the technologies you're using to do that, as well as the behaviors you're demonstrating as you're using that information, is really important for a remote worker.
While we have you, Scott, we're talking, health. Another question was, is there a type of encryption that's sufficient for HIPAA and FERPA?
That's a pretty broad question in terms of what type of encryption, because the question would naturally be encryption for what. If you have encryption at rest for like a computer hard drive, or are you talking about encryption over the network if you have a secured connection? There are industry standards for encryption levels. I won't go to them in too much depth because it's a very technical discussion. But most technologies that people are using that offer encryption are going to be effective and adequate and appropriate in terms of standards. So the question is, if encryption is available to you for use, for example, can I encrypt the hard drive on my computer to protect my data? My encouragement of people is to use it and apply it, especially when it relates to portable media like USB drives. Having unencrypted USB drives can be very much a risk if you've got sensitive data on those types of devices. So, ensuring you're using encrypted USB drives, your hard drives are encrypted, making sure you're going to websites that use HTTPS, which there's a growing majority of websites nowadays that do, and there are visual indicators in your browser that make sure you know that that's what you're using, things like that. So if there's a more specific question about encryption, we can go into more detail, but that would be my generic answer.
Yeah, and please enter that into the chat if there's a follow-up there. Chip?
So we've had a little bit of experience with this, and I certainly don't have anywhere near Scott's experience working with that sort of information. But I think that this whole, like the way that we treat that information and the way that our networks need to be structured really is going through a pretty dramatic change right now. That's what we're seeing. Like we can't have a Scott and his team, of, I don't even know how many people, but it's more people than we have here at our organization. It's just not accessible to us, right? And so what we're looking at is changing the way that we do the whole thing, right? And so a couple of years ago, we would have had a server in here, and in that server, we would have stored all of our sensitive data, and we would have tried to have policies and encryption and things like that, which would be just monumental to try to manage as a small business and run the business, right? And so what we're exploring, we haven't gotten there yet, but we're exploring using remote desktops that through a secure VPN, we go into those desktops, and then it doesn't matter what kind of platform we're on. And so then all of that encryption has to happen through the agreement that we have with the data provider. And this is something that Dirk knows a million times more than me, but we're looking at this solution because I don't want to have to be responsible for somebody's laptop in their house. And this removes that responsibility there and moves it over to the service provider because they have that built in. And so when it comes to HIPAA and when it comes to some of the other more sensitive data, what we find is there's kind of two approaches. There's a cloud-based approach by service, like Office 365. If you sign their business agreement, basically, if you sign off on that, then and you have the authentication you need, then that data storage can be HIPAA compliant. Or the storage can't be compliant, but the way that it's used can be compliant. So that's one solution, but the other is you still have to protect that. You still have to protect that endpoint of technology. And so that's why we're looking at big picture, moving that off to the cloud into a secure environment that employs a whole bunch of people who keep it secure.
Yeah, Dirk, your thoughts on that with, remote work, people using their own, devices?
Yeah, I think what Scott's got a great probably vision for, where this technology is going. So on that adoption curve, you always see enterprise on the front end of it. To Chip's point, they've got the resources to get there. They've got team. I don't know. I'm kind of interested, Scott. How many people are on your team?
We have about 1,000 people in our IS organization overall.
That's crazy, right? Like, who has that kind of resources in the SMB and mid-sized space? All those brains in the room. I used to work for a guy who we had a huge team, and he was like, if we only knew what we know together, And when you've got a team that big, like one of your biggest problems is just getting all the info out there, because collectively you know so much. And in the SMB space and mid-size space, I think Chip is right. Like, we're in a business posture today where there's so much expertise to just bolt on, like really almost niche expertise to bolt on in a subscription model to your business. Like, everything's going to subscription. I can get my groceries, I can drive my car, and I think in the business space that's happening too. And so now more than ever for SMB and midsize, there's this ability to kind of plug into technology partners, do it with a real low barrier to entry, and get some expertise on this, whether it's just consulting or it's really like kind of what Chip is saying, like the plug and play infrastructure. You know, that's kind of been our game, virtual systems game, for the last 7 years, is how do we take that enterprise technology that Scott has access to and bring that type of thing as a plug and play to SMB and mid-sized companies? Because that the technology's there, it's just the resources aren't there for people to know that it's there. So I think that's, you know, to your question, Andy, you know, I think the challenge is really like, how do we just figure out what we know for SMBs and mid-sized companies, and then just plug it in to the organization and start to take advantage of some of those technologies, because they're out there. And that's, you know, that's why we sit and do the webinars like this. It's fun just to do the education and spitball ideas and talk about, you know, how can we get better at it. And I think it's one of the biggest impediments to businesses making the right technology decisions is just, you know, putting more things in that category of what we know instead of what we don't know.
But I want to pile on a little bit, because I think this is a great strategy for small and mid-sized business. And frankly, it's a good strategy for enterprise scale businesses. I mean, even my organization, we flipped Office 365 18 months ago, and it's been far more effective for us to have someone else run that service and the complexity of it for us than the resources it took us to do it internally. We're going through right now transitioning our help desk system over to ServiceNow. We're switching our whole ERP system over to Workday. All these are cloud-based SaaS solutions. And so you know, at the hyperscale where these vendors are working, it's even at a larger scale of economy than what I can do in a large enterprise. So for small and mid-sized businesses to have access to that capability and the platform power that a Microsoft or a Google offers, and then you couple that with a good vendor, a partner like Dirk and his team, who understand the space, that can help you figure out, how do I easily get into this environment and set it up correctly, and then they can step away and you can let it run, because you know the provider on the back end is managing the complexity for you and you're benefiting for it.
So another specific question we got in advance. It's kind of general, but what would be the best way to manage my SharePoint on Microsoft Cloud? And I think that question, I'm guessing it's coming from more of maybe a data security standpoint, given the topic of the webinar. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, let me take the first crack at it. Your first order of business is to understand what Microsoft does in the management of that data on their own. They've got a lot of great resources. You can just start Googling it, but it's on their site. They got a lot of documents and say, hey, you put your stuff in Office 365, here's our responsibility. And they actually call it a shared responsibility model, which implies there's stuff you can do. So you do have a role in some of that, and there's some great tools that you can bolt right into Office 365 to take that responsibility and do it too. We hear a lot of customers who go to Office 365 and they like kick back in their chair and they go, now I don't have to think about that data anymore. And that's not true. Microsoft is thinking about some of it for you, but they're making decisions on it too. And they're making the best decisions for Microsoft, and some decisions that will appease customers too. But I think your first gig is, let's know what they're doing and why they're doing it, and decide, is that enough for me, or am I good with that? Or should I plug in a tool to my Office 365 data to give me better access to actually controlling that and doing some of your own things with it, keeping it longer than they would, for example, or not letting them delete it when they would want to delete it, those kinds of things. So yeah, I'm interested, Scott, in your perspective too on that.
Yeah, probably a good takeaway to review contracts with third parties, right? When you're entering.
Yeah, for sure.
Scott or Chip?
Yeah, well, just, I mean, with companies like Microsoft and Amazon, there's not a lot of flexibility typically in your contract negotiation. It's take it or leave it. That's how they work. Yep. Although, frankly, I mean, I actually had Amazon, and I appreciated them for saying this. They said to me straight up, we can't cannot give you the contract provisions you're asking of us, because if we did that for all of our customers, we simply couldn't afford it. It would be too much risk on their part and would cost too much to deliver the service, and they would price themselves out of the market. So there is a risk transference that takes place with these types of relationships, and more often than not, it works to your advantage. And as long as you've got a good partner that helps you set up the environment and manage it effectively, you're going to be in a good space. But Dirk makes some good points that in these cloud environments like SharePoint, there can be complexity in how you administrate and manage that environment. There are opportunities to plug in solutions. Microsoft's own licensing is complex to understand what you can do and what you can't. And sometimes what you seek is the next level of licensing, which means a larger investment. And that can be frustrating at times for different companies, depending on how much it costs you. And then the other side of that equation is how do you manage the content within the SharePoint environment? That sometimes is a wholly different challenge unto itself in terms of the design, marketing, content creation, management of the collateral, all of those issues. But you would have those, frankly, regardless of whether it was hosted at Microsoft or on-prem.
Yeah. So we use Office 365. We use SharePoint for our file storage for the most part, but we found that their retention policies were not sufficient. And I went in there with the assumption that they were, and we sat there with that for a long time. And then we didn't have a full-blown incident, but we had a little bit of a scare at one point in time. And I realized that, you can have internal bad actors too, right? Someone in your organization or leaving your organization and that's really one of your probably bigger risks because they have access to your systems. And so what I realized was that the SharePoint solution did not retain our data against internal breaches as well as it needed to. Or accidental breaches, someone accidentally deletes stuff. So we use a backup solution. We use virtual systems to do it, but it's also very inexpensive. I don't have to think about it. And I know that our retention policies are longer than they would be through Office 365. Because I think it's if someone deletes stuff from your Outlook, it's gone after like 30 or 60 days. Isn't that right? Something like that. It's a short period of time.
So we have time for about, maybe one or two more questions here. This one, I love this. It's kind of again, one from our attendees, but how can we protect our family and friends against weaponized big data geared towards prompting consumers, with behaviors or other targeted opportunities, because more and more companies are deploying disruptive tech. They create indistinguishable threats and can alter the course of planning. They mentioned that this is kind of a big picture thought, especially as, the Internet of Everything, is entering our lives. So Scott, is your family subject to, phishing tests that you're testing them on a regular basis to make sure that they're responding correctly and making the right choices? Or, any reaction to that question about what, we need to be doing, in our personal lives as well when it comes to this?
Well, what's interesting is I was listening to the question, I was taking it a little different way. So maybe I'll give you my answer that I was going to and see if I'm consistent, because I don't put my own family under phishing requirements, but we do all have multi-factor authentication enabled. But what I was thinking the question was related to is more the privacy element of big data and all that these different vendors are doing to access your information. And my only simple response is stop sharing your data. There's a saying, if you aren't paying for the product, you are the product. And, a lot of companies will offer up free services that are very attractive. But then we have to understand that they're going to use the information they gather from us as we're using those solutions in ways that benefit those companies. And we may not understand that fully when we start using those solutions. And when we get to the point of realizing it, then we start to get irritated and angry. And then we're like, all right, so now what? You knew this was happening to you, yet you still did it. So there's accountability on both sides, when companies are not being transparent about their practices, but also when we're just jumping in and leaping with the use of these tools with no awareness or understanding of what information we're giving up and how we're using it.
But TikTok is fun. They would never take my data.
We run into this a ton in the legal space, right? Because if you're going through a lawsuit, if you're going through a civil lawsuit and you're posting things on social media, that's going to come out. I mean, even if you have your settings locked down, they can subpoena it, they can get a hold of it. So stop, like Scott said, stop telling people when you're leaving the house. You know, don't tell people when you're going on vacation. Like, avoid doing that. And then I also like to use an ad blocker, which is going to at least block some things. So I use uBlock Origin, and it's a free plugin to Chrome. There's other ones out there. I don't know that that's the best one, but at least if I want to opt in to a particular site, now I have the choice, and I can say, okay, I do trust these guys. I probably shouldn't, but I do trust these guys enough to say, yep, I'm going to let you serve me ads, and you can make some money off my visit. You can also scrape my data. And the thing that's happening there is, and we're a marketing company, so we utilize some of this stuff too, but just because you visit this website does not mean that your visit from this website stops at this website. That's being shared to a broad network. And so thousands and thousands and thousands of websites will be in the same network, so that they've got this usage behavior and they know who you are. Even if you're going through, and at this point, even if you're going through a VPN, even if you're taking some precautions there, just based off of the pattern of knowing what kind of computer you're using and what kind of sites you're visiting and what that browsing behavior looks like, they still know who you are. And so that can be used for ads, but it can be used for other less nice motives as well.
And now we know that Heroes of New Earth is one of those companies or apps that will share your email. So final question, I kind of want everybody to answer it, take a crack at it. It's a two-part question. What's the big takeaway you want attendees today to leave with when it comes to cybersecurity? And then what are you most hopeful about in this realm as you look forward? Dirk, I'll start with you because you didn't weigh in on the last question.
Yeah, well, I'll quick weigh in and say, create a culture of don't click on stuff. I got teenagers in my family, and you know, I think it's good. We try to talk about that, and probably the light side of cybersecurity best practices. But they've got phones and they got computers, and you know, it creates problems. So quit clicking on stuff. So anyway, I hope that that anybody listening to the webinar just comes away with a sense of, hey, there's good information out there, and it's on me to educate myself about my business, about my family, just on some best practices. And you can do that just by, you know, of course, everybody's default now is to Google things, but put some people around you who know some of this stuff too, and you know, create those conversations in your business community so that you're thinking about it, so that you're making some good decisions. And ultimately, the decisions that you make about cybersecurity, maturity, and best practices are going to be custom to your business. They're going to be different for everybody, but a lot of the good ideas apply to most, if not all people. So, you know, I think hopefully that's a takeaway, is just the tools are out there to educate yourself. And I want to encourage anybody who is maybe feeling like they're not doing enough of that to, you know, just kind of budget it into your monthly schedule at some point. And you know what, like, I'm super hopeful for the tools that are out there. It can be a little bit depressing and overwhelming to think about, like, man, so many breaches, so much risk for my data. Like, I've got, you know, maybe you don't only have 20 employees like Chip does, but it's still like 20 people who are click happy, and how we protect our stuff. It can get overwhelming, but there's great tools out there. There's great solutions. They don't cost a lot, and a lot of them don't cost anything. It's just a matter of kind of creating the right culture and doing it. So the tools are really good, and I'm hopeful that we keep solving, you know, the problems that cybersecurity issues bring to the business. We keep solving them in neat and creative ways. So,
thanks, Scott, and then Chip.
I guess I would say, you know, be aware of what you're doing and your surroundings and how you're doing it. Be vigilant and maintaining awareness of that, and don't be intimidated by the complexity that this issue could present. You know, I'm struck by my 16-year-old daughter as she's learning to drive still, and we're working on getting her hours for the different levels of her license. And so as we're teaching her to drive and taking her out, you know, driving a vehicle can be a very dangerous thing if you do it the wrong way. If you're driving at 200 miles an hour, it takes a different set of skills and capabilities and a support team to manage the safety of the driver versus a driver driving on the street. So, wear your seatbelt, have your headlights on at night, keep the temperature at the right, level inside the vehicle so your windows don't fog up if it's cold out and you're breathing hot air inside the car. And you do all the right things and you can operate that vehicle in a safe way, and she can feel confident knowing that she is aware of what the risks are, but she's doing some simple things that can help protect her to make sure her journey is safe. In cyber, it's the same way. If you pay attention to some of the fundamentals, the easy things to do, multi-factor authentication, keep your computers patched and up to date, run antivirus and malware on your systems, be mindful of how much data you share about yourself. You keep all those things in mind, there's some easy things you can do that will keep you safe. And the bad guys are like water. They will seek the path of least resistance to take advantage of someone else. And so they will go by you if you're doing some of these fundamental things and seek someone else because you're not a target that's worth spending the time to try and attack because someone else is an easier one than you are. So, be aware, be vigilant, and do the simple things, and you're going to be in a much better position.
What are you most hopeful about?
What am I most hopeful about is that I think there is a tremendous community of people that are trying to make it easier to help people operate more safely from a cybersecurity perspective online. As Dirk said, there are lots of tools out there. We have companies that are offering tools at very low cost for consumers. There's a lot of free software out there that people can take advantage of. There's a lot of knowledge, and there are communities of people who are willing to share and help people learn how to better protect themselves in this world. And so the goodness of people in our world is there. You just have to look for it, and it's not hard to find.
That's a good ending on being hopeful. Chip, follow that.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks. I was so hoping I wouldn't have to go last. No, I think the thing I'd like people to take away is understand the risk to your business and treat it like you would anything else. If you knew there were a series of break-ins up and down the street where your office is or your store is, you would lock the door. You might call your insurance company and make sure that you've got coverage for that type of risk. And so do the basic things that Scott just laid out. Make sure that you have cyber attack insurance, right? So like you insure yourself for a fire, you insure yourself for a break-in, and there too, if you know that every business around you has had a series of break-ins, you'd make sure that you have property casualty insurance. Make sure you have that insurance. And then also reach out to your vendors, your partners. Make sure that they're doing the things. The people that touch your data, make sure they have that insurance, right? Because if they get breached and you get brought into it, you're just hanging out there if you don't have that specific coverage. So get that, do the things that Dirk and Scott laid out. And then as far as things that I'm hopeful of, it really is going to kind of mirror what Scott said. We've got partners like Dirk who work with virtual systems. They know this stuff a lot better than I do. I can take this thing off my plate. I can focus on my business. We have other partners in this space too. We use Office 365. They're great. I feel confident in their multi-factor authentication and their security. So that's part of the solution that they provide. And I'm interested in this stuff, but I don't have time to focus on it in the day-to-day. We've got a business to run. We've got creative to come up with. So lean on the people who I love having the conversations I've had with Scott. He shows me this stuff. It's super interesting. It makes me want to share it with everybody. Just soak that all up, and then utilize those tools and those people that are out there that really love this stuff, and they'll make sure that you're safe and your business can go on and you won't be affected.
I think that's a great way to end. And we have a saying at the chamber is that we don't know everything, but we know people who do, right? And that's one of the things that makes the West Michigan business community so great. And I also want to thank LaFleur Marketing for making sure we're all safe out there these days. It's one of my go-tos now.
Thank you. Thank you.
I do want to thank Chip for bringing us all together for this, and for all the attendees for all the great questions, and really appreciate the robust discussion on, again, a very important topic when it comes to creating a climate for business success. You got to get this right. The tools and the information are there, as well as the experts you can tap into. So on behalf of everyone on the panel, you have our contact information if you'd like to get a hold of us, or if we could be of assistance going forward. And to all of you who spent the time with us this afternoon, thank you, and have a great day.
Thanks, guys. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.